Good afternoon, and thanks for having me. But I'll be talking a little bit about the tools that we use for pavement preservation, in the city. It's going to sound a lot like what you've already heard from a lot of folks today and yesterday, but put a little bit with our experience. Just to talk about our pavement network, we have just a little under 600 center line miles, 1,800 lane miles. Gentlemen from Utah, your lane units, or what you call them, surface areas, lane miles. I think that was something new I kind of picked up today, but hey, however you count it. We do, instead of like a route milepost, we do intersection from the city. It's just easier for us to manage our system that way. Because of that, we have approximately 7,000 segments and multiple surface types, but the majority of our surfaces are asphalt. We're like 97% asphalt. So for us, just talk about our pavement program just in general, just to try to tailor a little better with the topics, how they're presented. We've had used multiple pavement management systems over the years. Currently, we're using Street Saver for ours. The Hansen Infor, we tried that a few years back. It's our Public Works uses that as their maintenance management system. It does some general analysis for the assets, but it just wasn't robust enough to have the long-term forecasting we needed for asking for additional money. We do assess our condition of our streets every 2 years, and basically our treatment selections are based on the PCI. As I kind of mentioned a few minutes ago, we don't do IRI or get some of the roughness numbers to select our streets, so we're really using predominantly the PCI, and then with that we kind of take a look at the stresses when we get a little more into the weeds with it. But structural data, things like that, we get more on a project level than a network level. So just for a frame of reference for our program, in 17 we actually got additional funding for our program, an additional 3.6 million. So we have 10.4 million that we had this year, which included that additional funding. With that, we did a whole lot of ramp work because in the city and urban area, sidewalks, it's a big deal. So out of that 10.4, we spent about 1.6 million roughly on ramps this year. So it took a good chunk of our budget, but it's just part of doing business anymore. 23 lane miles of it were rehabilitation work, which would be related to any kind of overlays or any kind of asphalt on the ground for us. And then 115 lane miles of preservation surfacing type work. The next slide, really it's just a map of the city and a little bit of a view of where we did work. It's kind of hard to read on this, so if you look on it, I guess if you've been to Vancouver, maybe you care. If not, it's just a map, but we kind of try to spread our work around through the whole city as much as we can. We really try to split our system into east and west of I-205, and we do our preservation treatments typically on one half of the year and trying to group projects together to make it more productive for contractors coming into the area so they don't have as many stockpile sites and whatnot. To talk a little bit about our rehabilitation, we do traditional mill and inlays, overlays, some limited pulverizing and paving, mainly on residential streets right now. We got a lot of old, just thin, asphalted streets that need work, and so we do that on those versus our arterials. And currently our program is not based on full reconstruction of our roadways. We talk about the worst first, what's going on with that. In a few years we'll start getting that. Our system, actually kind of guess, not that I need to go back to this, but our funding really is set up, that 10.4 million has the goal of trying to maintain our condition over time with a slight bump as we move along to increase the condition of our system. Because prior to that we had about 7 million with this additional, and we maintained our arterials, but we had that slow, as our Public Works director called it, we had the streets death panel that oversaw the slow bleeding deterioration of our system over time. So with this additional funding, we're maintaining. So what are our preservation tools that we've used? We've used a number. Apparently, we got some catching up to do with the city of Roseville to get to the number of treatments that we've tried that they have, but we've done traditional slurry seals, microsurfacing, chip seals, cape seals, and a few other treatments that we've either used or are looking at using in the near future. With slurry seals, we've been using that the longest. Been using that since the late 90s, residential streets only. We tried them on some arterials, but just with traffic and whatnot, the roads, just, the slurries wouldn't hold up to it, wore through, weren't successful. So for a number of years, it was either a slurry on a residential street or some kind of paving on their arterials. While we have used it on streets that are much lower than a 70 for our PCI, really for us, ideally to get the life and the amount of prep and whatnot, 70 is our target range, kind of bottom end, where we use slurries. And in terms of the overall life, 8 to 10 years is kind of what we plan. Because of funding and how long they've lasted, they really go beyond 10 years a lot of times on residential streets, just because of the amount of prep we do in advance and because of the fact that there's hardly any traffic. But our goal is now to really get into that 8 to 10 year kind of repetitive cycle to stay on top of our pavements now that we have the additional funding. Microsurfacing, we started using that in 2009, as kind of just mentioned. Prior to 2009, we had slurry and paving in our toolbox. We were looking at something on arterials that we could use, some kind of preservation treatment. So we looked at micro as an option. We worked closely with the contractors. I think John Coplans had mentioned yesterday that 20 years ago or whatever, someone tried micro in the area and it pretty much killed it for that time being. Well, the city was part of that before I came along, but definitely hesitant to use it. So started in 2009, had pretty good success, and since then we've been using it regularly as part of our preservation program. Ever since, we use both a type 2 and a type 3 rock, depending on the traffic and loads, and the type 3 are our busier arterials, where the type 2 typically goes on our collectors. We use both a continuous and truck-mounted application. Typically on the major arterials, we have the spec out the continuous run machine, just trying to avoid gaps, starts and stops. We try to tend to run a longer train, longer segments of roads together. So this one here, I guess talking about ADT, we're using them on the street. This one is pictures on in here was it's about a 16,000 ADT. And that's actually the one that we used in 2009. It's still performing well today. I'll get to this one instead of talking about life of it, but running pretty well. We also use it on some as high as 34,000 ADT, and on the right street, it's been effective. We haven't had, it's been holding up well. The one with the 34,000 or whatever ADT's been down for 3 years now, and still looks good after checking it out in the last couple of weeks. What we have found though for microsurfacing is we're using on a PCI of 70 now. Before, again, looking at options of what do you do in terms of once it gets a little bit past that, but you don't want to pave it. We really pushed it, especially early on our streets, using it on streets as low as 60. Those definitely are not performing as well as the streets that we're putting it on the correct street. So I definitely would stress that if you're looking at trying something new, make sure you're trying it on the right street. Again, we knew we were accepting some risk, but again, we're looking for something in between. So as noted, if you go lower than a 70, you're going to need a lot more prep to make it successful, but it can be done if you are really limited in your toolbox. So for us, we've had them down for 7-8 years now. So far, so good. I've only had a couple issues. Someone had mentioned it earlier today about getting warranty work done. We had an issue on some stuff that was placed last year. The contractor working for us was very responsive, came up and fixed it this year. It was really an isolated spot. It wasn't a widespread system thing. But anyways, for us, so far so good. And then another kind of general note too with this, since we're doing the micros on arterial streets, normally we have an ordinance that says you can't do night work. Well, in this case, we make the exception just because it's so much easier for traffic control, impacts to the public by doing the work at night, especially on the busier arterials. Then we move on to chip seals that we use. This is another one, a bad experience 20 years back for us. John was just talking yesterday, made me think about this. We started using it again in 2011. Had a bad experience on a major road 20 some odd years ago. They used like a 1/2-inch rock. That was a traditional chip seal. Wasn't swept well apparently. Tons of rock claims, rock chips. Just people not liking it because it's gray, it doesn't look right. So it was basically chip seals were a no-go for the next 20 some odd years until that transportation director retired, and we got the okay to try doing it on a limited basis. In 11, we worked with Clark County, not Clark County, Nevada, Clark County, Washington, to do some traditional emulsion chip seal for us. That's been down since for 6+ years now. Still is looking good. That was kind of our trial run to step into looking at other treatments, which we then moved into the 3/8-inch asphalt rubber chip seal, which we started that as part of a cape treatment in residential areas as the base layer, getting our feet wet in that. But looking at how well that went down and just in residential areas, and looking again, start looking at where can we find a tool to bridge that preservation 70, score a 70 or whatever down, but doing something before we get to needing to overlay it, where we started putting this and applying this on arterials and whatnot as just a standalone treatment as just a chip and not part of a cape. And so that's been successful to date for us. I'll get to that in here. And then this year we also tried a 1/4-inch chip seal on a residential street. We talk about the ADA impacts. We're looking, not to say not to avoid having to do ramps, but on certain streets and residentials, especially in the urban area that are 200-foot blocks, if you were to do a microsurfacing that triggers the ramps and you're doing about 3 times as much in dollars in ramp work as a treatment, we're looking at that balance of what makes sense. We're trying to preserve the road. So we're trying out some 1/4-inch chips to, again, look at another tool to kind of find that bridge of something between a slurry and a full overlay. And then with all of ours within the city, just to try to help keep rock retention and make it successful, we're fog sealing all of our chips just to kind of help that retention, make sure it's all black when they're done, and kind of have an overall product, again, trying to limit our risk so we don't go that situation 20 years ago where we get a bunch of people complaining because of loose rock and whatever, and we lose this tool as an option. As mentioned, the bridge treatment, 55 and up is kind of what we look at candidates for chip seals. We have gone lower on some. They haven't performed as well, but I guess we kind of knew that going in. I think Jason talked about expectations. We're pretty realistic about our expectations and try to get out in front of that to let people know what to expect. So far, in terms of our performance, we're getting pretty good life on them. We're on track to either meet or exceed what we're estimating for our life on these treatments. That first emulsion chip, as mentioned, we're 6 years into it. Looks good. Maybe it might need something in a couple of years, but in terms of what the pavement looked like before we put it down, definitely well worth the money. Those asphalt rubber chips are really performing well. And then again, the 1/4 chips, too soon to tell because we're 1 year down. These are just a couple of pictures, might be kind of hard to see. The one on the left was a 3/8-inch asphalt rubber chip. That's right outside an asphalt quarry. That's been down for 4 years. Really, there's not a lot of distress. There's about, let's see, I put my notes on the wrong one, about 9,000 ADT on that road on the left. So pretty good. We're not getting a lot of flushing. We have noted we've tried to push that 3/8-inch on a higher ADT, and we're seeing a little bit of flushing. So that's something to take into consideration when you're looking at it, the size of rock you're using. In the urban area, I don't think we can go to a 1/2 inch, but I think in some cases we need to look at it if we want to use that on higher traffic roads. And then the one on the right is the 1/4-inch chip street that we had done this year. So cape seals, we've started using in 2012, really as a way before we had funding of trying to get into neighborhoods to try to figure out how to do something in there. That was a lower cost than paving just because we didn't have the funds. So that's really we focused it. We now have since then have done some on arterials as well. So that's why we use either a slurry on the top or a microsurfacing, depending on the type of roadway that we're placing the cape on. We're looking at now for us PCIs at 50 or above. Initially, we used them on ones as low as 35. You had to do a little bit more prep, but so far, like this street here that's in this picture was one that was probably down around 35 or 40, and this is a picture this year. I have another picture, I think it's on the next slide, in terms of what a similar street. So the picture on the left is what the streets were that we were putting this cape seal on with this asphalt rubber chip. You can see it being highly cracked, as they say, it's the top one. Highly cracked, alligatored, but it's pretty low severity, even though it was over the majority of the pavement. So it's a sound asphalt, sound base. It's just that it's 40, 50-year-old pavement that's thin and cracked and needs something on the top. So then the picture on the right is what that street, basically right next to it, looks like now 4 years later. So it started on the left, 4 years later, it looks like the one on the right. Again, pretty good bang for our buck in terms of what we're getting. Just to kind of wrap up on other treatments we've done a few double chip seals where we've done double asphalt rubber chip seals on a highly alligatored, spalled edges. We put, it's kind of more of a happenstance where we put it down and you can still see the cracks and the joints. They were like, well, let's just throw something over the top of it. And, it covered those up, and we put a slurry over the top, and it's performing great. Again, part of it is it's in a residential area, so limited traffic. But again, something that we're keeping in our toolbox. We've also done some sandwich 3-step treatments, depending on who does the presentation of a microsurfacing on the bottom, a chip seal in the middle, and then a microsurfacing on the top. And next year we're looking at trying to do some bonded wearing course, and I think it was a Nova chip, I think is what it was called back in the day. I've seen that term out there. So we're looking at doing that starting next year. So this was kind of an example of that, the micro, chip micro. This is an old concrete highway, used to be the state highway, east-west highway in Vancouver. A lot of panels. No, there's no joint, doweling between the panels, so they're all just loose, moving. The panels are disjointed. It's highly cracked. The residence, it's pretty, it's a quote-unquote a bike route, not a good bike route. But I needed to look at doing something just to try to improve the ride quality in general. So we worked with the, again, the contractors that came up and had been working with us in the area on ideas. So we thought we'd go with this microchip micro. The micro initial course went down to kind of try to level out some of the joining, some of the low areas. We put the asphalt rubber chip in the middle. Again, kind of try to get something to make sure it stuck and came down, add some flexure so the cracks didn't come back through right away. And then another micro on the top for that kind of ride wearing course. And went from like on the picture on the left, the PCI is probably, if you scored it, would have been down in the like 40s. Right now, I think when they last scored it, it was about an 80. So you can still feel some of the irregularities in it, but 4 years later, or sorry, I guess we're 3 years later into it, seeing pretty good performance on that. Now, as I told last week, unfortunately, the neighbors down there, it's down along the river, kind of pretty high-end neighborhood. It wasn't smooth enough. They could still feel a bump. And so we're going to be paving and doing some work over the top of this, and going to be spending, this cost us about $10 a yard to do, and instead we're going to be spending $35 a yard and taking about 3 or 4 times as long to get it all done.
Are all your cape, this is Gary Hicks, are all your cape seals asphalt rubber?
We have a few that ended up being the emulsion chip, but almost all of them are the asphalt rubber.
Okay, thank you.
Was that micro hot rubber, or?
Yes, it was a hot rubber. It's what we had in our contract at the time. Again, we were minimizing our risk, so we wanted to try to do something we felt comfortable with that, increased our chances of success to theoretically keep doing it again, even though we're not. So
I'm jealous. I've been wanting to do one of those for years, man. And then the other thing, have you gotten any, those are some beautiful roads. Have you gotten any pushbacks on the chip seals with the cycling community?
Not too much, because we haven't really put them on roads that, even though I think the first picture I had a bike lane in it. This one here, it's a bike lane, but it's not very heavily trafficked. So we haven't, but we're looking at pushing it towards streets. So I think Jason had mentioned using the steel drum roller earlier, and I think that's something that we're going to require to do, at least down the bike lanes as part of that, if we do it on a heavier traffic corridor. But I'm sure it'll come. If they ride on it and they hit it, they'll let us know.
Yeah, Ryan, can you, my understanding is you partner with some of the other local agencies to bring this work to several agencies at once to get some efficiencies there. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so what John's asking about is partnering with other agencies. So we got someone from Clark County here. It started out, we've been doing it for really since the early 2000s, where we've done a joint contract for slurries. We also did it for, extended to microsurfacing and chip seals, also some of the smaller agencies. So we've done it basically as an entire bid package. We get together before the year starts, ask who wants to do work together, and then we all kind of get our list together, and then someone takes the lead to put the specs and bid package together, but we all utilize one bid, so the contractor's bidding on everybody's work all at once. It also, for that bond and wearing course, Hillsboro's looking at doing some more next year, and I think City of Gresham, sorry, for those out of the area, those are ones over in Oregon, and we're in Washington. So we actually talked last week, we have the ability to actually do a joint package even across state lines. Again, trying to get that volume to make it more appealing to contractors to come up into the area, as well as get a better pricing for us. All right, well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
The preceding video was produced by the National Center for Pavement Preservation. More information can be found at tsp2.org. That's tsp2.org. Additional support provided by Michigan State University.